Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, Knowing What Teachers Know About Teaching. The webinar will focus on teachers' professional competence and the challenges the profession is facing in the 21st century knowledge society, and we'll discuss some key findings in OECD's new report, Pedagogical Knowledge and the Changing Nature of the Teaching Profession. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation, so please send any questions you have to Eric Magnuson via the chat function in WebEx. And for your information, the WebEx is being recorded and will be available from our website at www.oecd.org/edu in the next few days. I would now like to hand you over to Dirk van Dam, Head of the Information and Measuring Progress Division of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills.
Thank you, Rachel, and good afternoon or good morning wherever you are on this world. I'm very thrilled to do this presentation and this webinar because it's really a very important topic, I think. At the OECD, we do a lot of work on teachers and teaching. We have the TALIS survey, and I will start by exploring a couple of findings from TALIS on teachers. And we have the TALIS video study, which is now coming very soon. I will speak on behalf of a specific project in the Center for Educational Research and Innovation, CERI, on innovative teaching for effective learning, ITEL. And we try to focus a little bit on what are the key questions, what is the key of teachers' professionalism. When we have the TALIS survey, we have seen that teachers, for example, have a high need of professional development. I'm not going to explain this chart in detail, but one of the recurrent findings of every TALIS survey is that teachers really indicate that they have a high need for new knowledge, for knowledge that helps them to do the work in the classrooms that they are doing. For example, special needs students, ICT skills, questions about technologies, etc. So teachers actually feel not very competent with the knowledge they have. A second finding that we have from the previous TALIS surveys is that the initial teacher training that teachers got is not enough. Becoming a professional takes time and takes a lot of experiential learning, especially in the first years when they come into the teaching practice and the teaching profession. Look at this chart, for example. New teachers, and we define new teachers as teachers less than 2 years in the profession, they spend less time in class on effective teaching and learning than experienced teachers. And why is that? Because they have to spend a lot of time on creating the environments and creating the conditions for effective teaching and learning. They have to spend more time on keeping order in the classroom, for example. So you see in these charts that teachers have to acquire the abilities and the competencies to be effective as a teacher, and this takes time and an awful lot of experience. Again, when we investigate the self-efficacy of teachers, we again see that it takes a lot of time and a lot of experience to feel competent as a teacher. And you see that in the beginning the self-efficacy is lower, and then it grows over time. But becoming a professional teacher is also takes time, because it's mainly a kind of induction process. It's a kind of adaptation to dominant forms of knowledge, to dominant forms of practice. It's not something that happens through innovation. And there are many stories of teachers which can maybe act as a kind of narrative behind this, but we also see it in data like this. Teachers feel not rewarded by innovation. they, especially in the beginning of their career, when they come from a teacher training college, they often want to apply what they have learned in school, but it doesn't work that way. Teachers, older teachers or more experienced teachers frequently say to newcomers, well, forget everything you've learned in teacher training. Here is the real life, and you have to learn everything by experience and not by being innovative and or to apply the research knowledge that you have learned in school. So these few elements, they point at the very important aspect of the development of teacher professionalism over time through learning, through experience, learning through practice, etc. So this brings us to a more conceptual question. How can we actually define teacher professionalism? In the previous publication here at the OECD, we defined it as mainly consisting of three big parts. First part, knowledge, and we will delve deeper in this in the course of this presentation. Second part, autonomy. A very important part of being a professional is being able to make decisions on various aspects of the teaching and learning process. And a third very important element is being part of a community, being part of a network of peers and peer learning happening in that network. And these three parts reinforce each other and, of course, will have to work together very well in order to create professionalism. On the knowledge dimension, of course, there are a lot of elements that come into play here. And these are the elements that we try to discover in TALIS. For example, professional development, support for research, participation in service learning, induction, etc., etc. Autonomy is, as I said, the capacity to make decisions over curriculum, over resources, over content of classes, over assessment practices, over how to keep order and discipline in the classroom. And then the peer networks, induction, mentoring, receiving peer feedback, developing continuous professional development in networks of peers, etc. You can try to measure these things, and this chart has been developed in TALIS on the basis of what teachers themselves report on these various dimensions and various issues. And then you can more or less give an estimate of the level of teacher professionalism in a country. This has been published last year, and for me it is important because actually this chart shows that we are circling around a lot of the information. We do not really directly assess, for example, the knowledge dimension in teacher professionalism. We try to estimate it through all kinds of proxies. And this project on which I am reporting now is actually more ambitious. We try to develop more measures and direct assessments of and we start with teacher pedagogical knowledge. We try to have a good understanding of what does it mean being knowledgeable as a teacher in creating effective teaching and learning environments for all students. So let's focus now on knowledge. I'm not saying that the two other dimensions are not important, but we think that the knowledge dimension is very, very important and becomes even more important in the knowledge societies that we are living, and also because teaching becomes more challenging and teachers become knowledge professionals. That's actually one of the basic ideas behind this presentation. And I do this presentation, we do this webinar, because we published just a few days ago a very important publication, I think, Pedagogical Knowledge and the Changing Nature of the Teaching Profession, which is a book exploring these themes. You will see at the end of my presentation that it is actually one of the first steps in a longer project where we actually want to move to more data-driven research and surveys and assessments. But this volume gives you an idea from a conceptual point of view what we mean by teachers' pedagogical knowledge. And I'll explore a few themes of things that have been discussed in this book, and of course it's highly recommended reading, and it's available on our website. I will say a few words about the context and policy challenges and the questions arising from that. I'll say a few words on the knowledge base of the teaching profession, what we know about that. A few words on measuring, because we are not the first ones who are addressing the measurement question, of course. Others have done some very interesting pioneering research on this. And then a few words on more, let's say, looking at the future. What are the demands on teacher knowledge that are confronting the teacher professional knowledge base? Context and policy challenges. When we say that teachers are becoming knowledge professionals and actually should be seen as knowledge professionals, what do we mean by that? We do think that the complexity of questions that are coming from the larger social context to the teachers ask them to become much more knowledge intensive. It's not with a very simple knowledge base, which may was effective in a few decades ago, that you are going to answer these questions. For example, technological developments which are penetrating education, ICT, the much more heterogeneous nature of the student population, with all their different talents and all their different needs and problems, the necessity to develop different kind of skill sets, the need to develop students to become lifelong learners, etc., etc. All these questions add to the complexity of what is expected from teachers. And we simply don't think that without a very powerful knowledge base, which is embedded in the teaching profession, the profession is going to be able to meet these questions. There are, of course, also a number of policy challenges, and these are also explored in the first chapters in the book. And these questions are very much on the agenda in every country. When we speak here at the OECD to education ministers, it's always the first kind of questions that they put on the table. How can we attract more people, more motivated people, high-achieving candidates into the profession? And once we have them there, how can we train them well, and how can we retain them? This is a very important element, because the attrition rate for new teachers is actually very high in many countries. In the USA, for example, almost 50% of new teachers leaves before their fifth year of practice. And figures in other countries are equally worrisome. So the difficult experience that teachers have coming out of teacher training and moving into the profession, with the problems that we know, which is lack of induction, lack of mentoring, not enough opportunities for teacher professional development. All this adds to frustration, loss of motivation, loss of self-confidence, and then ultimately also leaving the profession. So we think that improving the strength of the knowledge base of teachers in order to cope with all these challenges is actually the way forward. So the questions then that we try to ask in this book and in this project is, what is actually the nature of the pedagogical knowledge base of the teaching profession? We don't think that the knowledge base is something very academic. There is a lot of research-based knowledge which goes in the knowledge base, but it's not the knowledge base of an academic. And a very important question as well, is the pedagogical knowledge base of the teaching profession up to date to meet these challenges and to meet these demands? And if I am allowed to say something really radical, I personally don't think that it's up to date. A lot of the knowledge base that teachers use is based on knowledge of a few decades ago. New knowledge is very has very difficulties to enter the knowledge base of the teaching profession. So these are very important questions. How can we conceptualize pedagogical knowledge? What are the dimensions? How can we measure it? What do we know about the impact on student learning? How is the teacher's pedagogical knowledge related to teacher motivations, to belief systems, to identity of teachers, and to overall professional competencies? Can scientific research become a stronger part of the pedagogical knowledge base? Can it inform teachers towards better teaching and to create more effective teaching and learning environments? How can we build a knowledge base that empowers teachers to meet these 21st century demands? So that are the questions that we are putting forward in this book. The essence, of course, is that in the professional triangle, and this triangle is not unique to teachers, it's a kind of triangle which is present in every professional practice. But in the case of teachers, you have, of course, the research-based knowledge coming on from educational research, from learning sciences, which is empowering and inspiring teaching practices in very indirect ways, because teachers do not apply textbook knowledge. Teachers integrate and incorporate new knowledge into their own experiential knowledge and into the tacit knowledge of the profession. And that's a very complex process, and we actually don't know very well how this process happens. And that, of course, then results in student learning. Student learning being, of course, the objective, the target of teachers' professional activities. So these activities and these dimensions are only possible, we think, when they are grounded in a coherent and integrated knowledge base as a fundamental characteristic of the teacher profession. Now, and that's the topic of another very important chapter in the book, chapter 2. We should not see the teacher's pedagogical knowledge as something static. It is changing all the time, and it's changing in reaction to all kinds of things that happen in the profession, but also in the education system at large. And the second chapter explores a number of these processes. For example, the codification of teachers' pedagogical knowledge and teachers' competency frameworks is a very important phenomenon, and we are exploring that also in another chapter, where we try to compare the codifications of teachers' competencies. So the questions that we can ask here: are these codifications improving professional practice of teachers? Are they facilitating access to knowledge? How can they facilitate building a more integrated knowledge base for teachers, etc.? So these are important questions. Apart from the structural dynamics, you can also look at teachers' pedagogical knowledge more from a functional perspective, because we are then talking about knowledge into action. As I said, and I will repeat it a couple of times, teacher's pedagogical knowledge is not textbook knowledge. It's not abstract knowledge. It's not academic knowledge. It's knowledge that is enabling practitioners to act in specific circumstances. So how is this interplay between knowledge production, knowledge integration, knowledge mediation, and then putting it into use? How is that happening? And here also we can ask a number of very important questions. How are these linkages? How are they happening? And how can they be strengthened? How can we build the capacity of everyone involved in these mechanisms to improve the knowledge to action processes? And how can we utilize existing knowledge and evidence to improve these processes? And then thirdly, a third very important dimension of the dynamic nature of the teacher's pedagogical knowledge is, of course, the social dynamics. All this is happening in social interaction. Knowledge is, to a large extent, also a social construct. Different people interacting create knowledge, they modify knowledge, they transfer knowledge. So the social processes in the knowledge construction are also a very important element in the dynamics of teachers' pedagogical knowledge. And how can we enhance and utilize and improve these mechanisms? For example, networks, communities of practice, to improve professional learning. And how can interactions between stakeholders and collaboration be exploited in a better way to facilitate a more dynamic nature of the teacher's knowledge? Actually, we ask these questions because, at least I personally do, I believe that the knowledge dynamics in the teaching profession is not what it should be. A lot of teachers' pedagogical knowledge is maybe out of date, but it's also not very dynamic. It could and it should be much more dynamic. And yeah, it's sometimes risky to compare with the medical profession, but in the medical profession, the renewal and the constant dynamics in building and maintaining and improving and innovating knowledge, these dynamics are much more powerful. In the teacher profession, at least that's a hypothesis that we have, and or something that we believe based on the anecdotal evidence that we have. In the teacher profession, we think that this kind of dynamic is actually rather slow and could be improved a lot. So let me formulate already a couple of key messages on this stage. Teaching as a profession needs a robust, systematic knowledge base, constructed and shaped by communities of professionals, by researchers, but also by practitioners. It's not only academic knowledge, as I said. Knowledge dynamics can be viewed as a complex system, a movement which involves multiple actors interacting in shaping teachers' knowledge. We don't think that teachers are the passive recipients. Teachers are the creators of knowledge, and we should empower teachers and also teachers educators to take charge of this dynamic nature of the teacher's pedagogical knowledge base. Okay, next part. Maybe going a bit more in depth into the conceptualization of what we mean by this phrase, teacher's pedagogical knowledge. And of course, we refer here to the seminal work of Schulman already in the 80s. I think most people are familiar with that because it's really a very important base of evidence and research on the knowledge base of teachers. And he made this famous distinction between content knowledge, and math teachers need to know math. Pedagogical content knowledge, math teachers need to know how to teach math, but also general pedagogical knowledge. And in our work, we are now more and more focusing on general pedagogical knowledge. That's the more difficult part to define, I think. There are other forms of knowledge also mentioned in the work of Schulman, curriculum knowledge, etc., etc. But let me focus on the three first, and then moving to general pedagogical knowledge. And Schulman defined these as principles and strategies of classroom management, organization, cross-curricular, etc. We would define it more in the sense of knowledge that helps teachers to create teaching and learning environments and interactions. As I said, we are not the first ones who explore this. A number of researchers and colleagues, mainly in Germany, but also in the United States, have done very interesting work. And actually, we are building on these research experiences, and they are also reported on in the book. For example, the TEDS-M survey, which has been initiated by the IEA a couple of years ago, is a very interesting and important research project, which has led to a number of very interesting insights. And Sigrid Blömeke, one of the authors in the volume, she reports on the experiences and what they got out of it from the TEDS-M survey. I just want to focus on a small number of findings. What the TEDS-M survey found is actually that teachers' content knowledge adds to higher student achievement. I think this is quite obvious, but it's always good to see this confirmed in research. Excuse me. Teachers who master math better, they add to better learning among their students. But also, a higher level of teachers' pedagogical content knowledge adds to higher student achievement. Teachers who know better how to teach math also have students learning math in a better way. Higher levels of teachers' pedagogical content knowledge also adds to a higher quality of instruction as an independent effect. But also, and this is becoming then very interesting for our topic, higher levels of general pedagogical knowledge adds to higher quality of instruction. So what is interesting here is that the TEDS-M survey has confirmed that general pedagogical knowledge is something that exists, that it can be assessed, and that we can see that it also adds to the quality of teaching. Because you have some people who say, well, actually teaching is about the content knowledge and it's about the pedagogical content knowledge. General pedagogical knowledge, we don't know whether that's really important, whether it really exists outside of the content, outside of the subject field knowledge. And I think based on the TEDS-M survey and some other activities in the research area, we can now say, no, there is something very important in the teacher's pedagogical knowledge, which is adding to the knowledge base of teachers and which is improving the teaching and learning in classrooms. Another important insight is that, of course, knowledge is only part of teachers' overall competence. So we never should study teachers' pedagogical knowledge or general pedagogical knowledge as something isolated from other parts of the professional competence. For example, belief systems, the motivation, goal-oriented aspects, metacognition and self-regulation, self-efficacy, and more ethical dimensions, professional responsibility, etc., etc. So all these things, of course, interact, and in teaching itself, all these elements are constantly mobilized in interaction with each other. I'm just going to explore a few things, but we don't have the time to go in depth here. Teacher motivation is linked to teacher pedagogical knowledge, to the decision-making strategies that enables high-quality instruction, to the willingness to engage in professional development, for example, to the motivation of students, to well-being and job satisfaction. So teacher motivation is an important element. Then when we want to see how these things are put into practice, actually this is a much more complicated element, and because teachers have to develop a vision, it is very important that to see how teachers draw on their general pedagogical knowledge to notice and make an interpretation of relevant features in the classroom. There is a lot of this in the book. I'm not going to, but because I see that time runs fast, to go into detail here. Let me just conclude this short section with a set of other key messages. General pedagogical knowledge is indeed relevant for high quality instruction, but also motivational factors, affective characteristics, other elements in the professional competence of teachers interact with knowledge, and they also matter a lot. The comprehensive model of teachers' competence thus also includes the transformation of knowledge into practice, into actionable knowledge. In the book, we have explored prior research, which provides a good basis for future studies, and which we now try to develop into reliable and valid instruments which can be implemented cross-culturally and in different countries. But there are still an awful lot of methodological challenges, and we still don't know very well how cause and effect relations exist between a sound pedagogical knowledge base and effective teaching. We should not, and I'm not suggesting here that these are very simple relations, that a better knowledge base leads directly to better teaching. That would be far too simplistic. So actually one of the ambitions that we have in this work is also to explore the complexity of how knowledge is developed, but also how knowledge is then put into practice. Let me say a few words on the important topic in the book on what are the changes that we can expect in the demands and the skills demands where the teacher's pedagogical knowledge has to take account of. We all know the whole rhetoric about 21st century skills, and there is a lot of rhetoric and unnecessary rhetoric, but there is also something real happening, I think, and we see it also in other work going on here in the Education Directorate at the OECD, where we explore, for example, new demands from curricula. We see that new skills are constantly referred to also by employers, by the outside community: critical thinking, creativity, reasoning, argumentation, innovation, and then also the communication skills, the interpersonal skills, metacognition, self-regulation, social and emotional skills, teamwork, etc. So I could name a very long list, and colleagues here in the directorate are trying to organize a little bit this very fluid and complex and sometimes confusing discourse on 21st century um, skills. But um, the point I want to make here is that communication, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving are becoming really key components of what we can call deep learning, of more effective teaching and learning environments. And the teacher's pedagogical knowledge, as it exists today, is probably not yet well tuned to take into account these rather drastic changes in new demands, new skill demands, and new ideas about learning. Another area where we think that the teacher's pedagogical knowledge base is not really up to date is the whole area of learning sciences. And of course, there is a lot happening now in brain research, in neuroscience, in cognitive psychology. And some people say, well, this is going to lead us nowhere. And this is all, it's still too early to say something meaningful about the impact that it will have on teaching. We are not so convinced. We think that it's still very early, but some very important concepts have to find their way into the teacher's pedagogical knowledge base. Let me think, for example, of brain plasticity. One of the key concepts in contemporary neuroscience. New ideas about memory and working memories. New ideas about emotional regulation, which all find their origins in contemporary research in the neurosciences. We have to find ways in which these ideas and these forms of research knowledge can be translated into teachers' pedagogical knowledge. And there is an interesting chapter in the book written by a couple of really world-class colleagues in the field of learning sciences who are exploring this process of translating the new findings and the new evidence that comes out of neuroscience and cognitive psychology into teachers' pedagogical knowledge. So the point that we try to make in this part of the book is that findings from learning sciences, even very early and maybe for some premature, but they do have the potential to update, to broaden, to deepen teachers' knowledge about student learning. 21st century skills, something similar. More research is needed, but we also think that this is going to upgrade and update teachers' pedagogical knowledge. And we are better prepared in the teacher profession to take into account these new developments. I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, and actually what I have said so far, we have tried to integrate it in a more conceptual way, in maybe a conceptual map. And I want to start at the bottom here, because I'm not suggesting that every knowledge finds its origin in research, but it's maybe from a pedagogical point of view the easiest way to explain the conceptual map. There is a lot of research, and for example, the research on neuroscience and deep learning finds its way into teacher learning and the opportunities that teachers have, new teachers, but also experienced teachers, in initial training and continuous professional development, in informal learning. But I personally think that informal learning is very important for teachers to find their way into the teaching profession, non-formal learning as well. So these opportunities to learn then lead to a complex set of knowledge, both content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, but also general pedagogical knowledge, which together with let's say, the most social and affective and motivational dimensions of teacher competencies, actually is put into practice through very complex systems of decision making, of sometimes very small decisions that teachers make in confronting situations in their classrooms, forms of professional judgment, sometimes not very rational, sometimes very rational, and all this then motivates and inspires teachers in their actual teaching behavior and teaching approaches and teaching strategies in classroom. And these teaching strategies then, of course, form and shape the instruction that happens in classrooms, and that shapes the learning of students, both cognitive but also social and emotional. So this is a kind of of wheel which is constantly turning, and which I think shapes the teacher's profession and what teachers actually do in classrooms. So I tried to give you a bit of an idea of what is in the book. As I said, highly recommended reading. But this is for us only the first step. Well, the next step is the question, can we assess teachers' pedagogical knowledge? And that's something we are now trying to do through the ITAL Teacher Knowledge Survey. We hope to report on the pilot in a few months, and then we will try to convince countries to move to a much more comprehensive and larger study, the ITAL main study on the teacher's pedagogical knowledge. And that's something that we hope to do in the future, and on which I hope to have future webinars, future opportunities to talk to you. Let me just finish with maybe a very strong statement. We believe that understanding and also valuing teachers' pedagogical knowledge is actually going to become the key for trusting teachers as professionals in the future. And I just make another maybe very imperfect analogy with a medical profession. I think today you would never put your health in the hands of a medical doctor if you are not really convinced that he or she has not the level of medical knowledge and very much updated medical knowledge you expect. I think, and I'm sincerely convinced, that today we should not be less demanding of the teachers to whom we entrust our children. Why would you be less demanding of the teacher? On the level of pedagogical knowledge of the teacher, you entrust what is most dear to you, which is your child. I'll finish here. I just want to acknowledge a lot of people who have been very influential, first of all, in organizing and hosting the symposium, which laid the groundwork for this book. I also want to thank Sonia Guerriero, who has been the editor of the book. I want to thank all the authors and the team at the OECD who has been editing and producing the book. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to see and hear your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for your very interesting presentation. We have some questions from people. Let me just start with the first one. You said that innovation is not necessarily rewarded in teaching, but in fact experience and adaptation to regular ways of working are. Do you think we should work to encourage innovation more?
Good question. Absolutely. The topic of innovation in education is a complex one, and we have several work streams here at OECD looking more into this. But we do find, well, we find two things. First of all, the good news is that according to our data, and we use a number of proxies to measure innovation in education and teaching, education is not that conservative as many people say. There are many ministers who say, well, teachers are conservative, it's quite impossible to change anything in education. That's not true. There is a lot of change happening in education. But the amount of change is not comparable to what we see happening in other big systems and big professional communities. And of course, the medical profession is always where we compare with most easily, and maybe we should find other systems to compare with. But we believe that the system in the medical profession is much more tuned towards innovation and focusing on the knowledge dimension. There are much more powerful mechanisms in the medical system to translate new research findings in biomedicine into medical practice and medical behavior of doctors. These systems are simply much more powerful. So by that already, the medical profession is much more innovation tuned. Whereas in the teaching profession, my impression is that actually becoming part of the teacher profession means that you are initiated in a body of knowledge which is not only outdated, but which is also a little bit hostile to innovation. I want to keep it by that because it's a very difficult topic to explain in a few words, but I hope that I have given you the essence of my thinking on this question.
Thank you. We have another question related to slide 26. You've asked to go deeper into the concept of codification. Maybe an example. Could you provide an example? What do you mean about that concept?
Yeah, there are different codifications of teachers' competencies. The European Union has listed the key competences for teachers. There are national competency frameworks for teachers. In my own country, in the Flemish community in Belgium, we have elaborated also the key competences of what we think a good teacher should be and should do. So that's what I mean by codification. So more or less formal statements where the basic dimensions and elements of teachers' professional competence are listed, and these codifications then inspire teacher educators to design curricula. They inspire also evaluation systems of teachers, etc., etc. So that's what I mean by codifications.
Thank you very much. Can you also can you speak more about the thought that the knowledge base is not up to date? Please speak. Maybe you could talk about the sciences or sources behind this thought.
As I said, it's when I give a presentation or a lecture or when I teach to my students, I always want to be a bit blunt because that makes it more interesting. But I'm not always convinced that I have a full evidence base behind this. I just want to provoke thinking. And that's the case here as well. I don't have data or a lot of evidence to demonstrate that. I only have anecdotal evidence. I have what we learn from Thalys, etc., etc. But I think the experience is not strange to people. When I speak to teachers and I say something about recent findings in educational research, there are actually few teachers who are up to date with that. If you look at a handbook, a teacher education handbook, it mostly ends its review of educational or pedagogical thinking with Vygotsky. Vygotsky is 40, 50 years ago. My daughter went to a teacher training college, a good one. And just out of curiosity, I reviewed her course materials. And actually, what she learned about cognitive psychology was the cognitive psychology of early 20th century, as if nothing has happened since then. I'm deliberately exaggerating a little bit to make my point, but I fear that the processes through which new research, new insights find their way into the body of knowledge which is taught in teacher training, which is taught in teachers' professional development, and which is incorporated by teachers, I just think that these processes do not really function very well. Yeah, there is a comment just coming on my screen. I know very well that age is not the only criterion, but that was the question. Is it up to date? I do believe that Dewey is incredibly important as a body of knowledge. I do believe that pestology is very important, etc. So age is not the only criterion, but if you ask the question, is the process of updating knowledge functioning well, then my answer is, I'm afraid not.
Thank you. I have possibly two related questions about initial teacher training, which you've in education, which you've just mentioned. So the book and the future study will look at recommendations on how to improve the curriculum and organisation of initial teacher education. Is the question, will it? And what type of policies do you believe can improve initial teacher education? Because that has been a tricky problem over the years.
I'm a bit hesitant to say yes, because that would create expectations and promises which I don't think we will be able to answer in the next few years, because there is a lot of work ongoing here in the Education Directorate. There is also a review of teacher initial education going on, and maybe those colleagues will be able to give policy advice and advice to curriculum developers in teacher education much more quickly than we are. Our ambition is to go really in depth into the topic of teachers' pedagogical knowledge. And of course, we hope by the time that we maybe will have finished the ITAL main study, when we have a very good understanding and a good assessment and a good measurement of the knowledge base into the national teachers' professions, that we will be able to draw conclusions for that which will be interesting for teacher educators and curriculum designers and etc. etc. But that's going to take some time.
Thank you. Through your presentation, you talked about commonalities between two professions, teachers and medical doctors. A question is, the latter developed their professional expertise through extensive internships of residency for several years before a board certification in a speciality. Might a similar rigorous approach work for teachers? Does it already exist in certain educational systems, and is there evidence for its effectiveness?
Well, I'm not suggesting that a medical model of training is the best one also for the teacher profession. But it has certain characteristics from which the teaching profession might learn a lot to rethink its process of professionalization of new professionals. And I think a couple of at every stage of the professionalization process, we can definitely improve, and we can learn from how this is happening in the medical profession. I think improving initial education. I would certainly improve the knowledge dimension in initial education. But more important for me is the transition from initial education into the profession. I think in most countries, we still have very severe difficulties in bridging the gap between theory and practice, in enabling teachers to move smoothly from teacher education into professional practice. So I'm exaggerating again a little bit, but in many countries, it's still the case that teachers have a bit of field work in their teacher initial education, but then they are dropped in schools, no induction, no mentoring. This is still happening, and I'm always wondering, how is this possible? How is it possible that we drop new teachers in such a demanding job? without an appropriate system of induction, without an appropriate system of mentoring, without an appropriate system of teacher professional development. And I know things are improving, but in the medical profession, they have built that system many years ago, and much more severely and much more seriously. And I just think that in the teaching profession, we allow things to move very slowly, and we allow the risks in the consequences that it has in student learning to happen. So that's a little bit my view on this.
Thank you. Another question I think is related in terms of professional development. As the complexity of teaching increases, a question is, I feel, is there a need to differentiate between teacher professional learning and teacher professional development? And should our profession place more emphasis on this understanding?
The question is a little bit confusing for me, because what is meant by differentiate? It is, I think there are several arguments also in the literature and in the community who say, well, the teacher is no longer existing. You have different kinds of teachers, and we should maybe thinking of specializing teachers to meet the different kinds of students, the different kind of needs of students, etc. And for the moment, we basically only differentiate between general teachers and maybe special need teachers. I think there is a good point in this argument, but I still think that there is enough commonality in what it means from a knowledge and a competence perspective to be a good teacher, to keep things as much as possible together. So I'm much more sympathetic to a view which is holding the various dimensions of teachers' competence together, and I'm not so much in favor of very rigid specialization of teachers. I don't know whether this is really the question, but that was my reaction to that.
Thank you. Another question is, our teachers' knowledge is not only individual, but also resides in their social relationships and is being created and potentially updated through their networks and collaborations. Is the future study going to take account of this social aspect?
Yeah, very good question. Yes, absolutely yes, with capital letters, because we are very wary of the risk that our work on teachers' general pedagogical knowledge is seen as something where knowledge becomes an attribute of individual teachers, and that it also becomes something on which teachers can be individually evaluated. That's not the way we see it. We see pedagogical knowledge as an attribute of the profession. So we see it as something collective, something social. And of course, it is to some extent embodied in the individuals being part of that community. But we don't think that you should start using the concept of pedagogical knowledge as something on which you assess individual teachers. You can assess the community of teachers. You can assess the profession, and that's how we do it. So we will make statements on the level of pedagogical knowledge in the community, because the social dimension, the social construction of knowledge is a very important element in this. Teachers should be seen as partners in a community of practice, and in collectively building and maintaining and innovating pedagogical knowledge, not as something individual. Very good question.
Thank you. One other question is, will the publication address digital learning, or is it looking at face-to-face in-class teaching? With the digital revolution, there are more and more online teachers.
Yeah. I think for us, this is not specifically dealt with in the book, but it's just part of what I mentioned in terms of the increasing complexity of demands on the teaching profession. So the capacity and the ability to work with different delivery modes becomes part of the competence that is understood and is supposed to be embedded in the teaching profession. So it's definitely part of that set of new expectations that add to the complexity, but it's not specifically focused on in the publication.
Thank you. I think we're talking back. Another question is, can this knowledge, all these skills for the 21st century that you mentioned, really be trained, or does this insight have consequences on the selection of students at the very beginning of their studies?
I think yes. I think knowledge and competences can be learned, but the process through which individual teachers, as members of that professional community, acquire the knowledge and competences is a bit broader than the word training suggests. And so for me, and I also prefer the word teacher education rather than teacher training, although there are very important elements of training, but that's more the skills dimension of being a teacher. But let me say that there are very different ways in which teachers acquire the skills, knowledge, and competences which make them a good teacher. Training is a small part of it. Learning and studying textbook knowledge is a small part of it. Being guided and supported and mentored when you start your professional career in schools is a bigger part of it. Continuous learning, informally, formally through continuous professional development practices is also a very important part of it. So I see this more as a chain of learning opportunities and a chain of professionalization practices through which knowledge and competences are constantly built and renewed and updated, etc.
Thank you very much. So for our last question, because I think we're coming to the wrapping up now, is it time for new research to become part of the body of knowledge for teachers, especially practitioners like teachers, and how do we make the gap between updated research and the updated body of knowledge smaller so that the new research is given to teachers earlier?
Yeah, that's another good question. There are several chapters in the book who deal with that question. It's the question about mediation, translation of new knowledge into actionable knowledge, etc. So indeed, we do think that there is a process needed between the creation of new knowledge through research, or also through experience in classrooms, because not all pedagogical knowledge finds its origin in scientific research. But this has to be mediated, translated, and you can organize that to some extent. And there are, for example, in Norway, they have an interesting knowledge center which is doing nothing else than this. So you have to organize the process of translation, incorporation, mediation of new knowledge into the teacher's knowledge base in an effective way. The book does not have final answers on how to best organize that process. Maybe that's something that we can turn to at a later stage of the project, but it's certainly a very important question that we have to address.
Well, thank you very much, Dirk. That was very interesting, and thank you for answering the questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer them all, but just to let you know that the PowerPoint that you just saw for attendance is going to be available online at SlideShare. And there's a SlideShare OECD Edu, knowing what teachers know about teaching, so you can find it there. And once again, just to remind you, the next few days, this webinar, the recording of this webinar will be available on our website at www.oecd.org/edu. So thank you very much indeed, Dirk, and thank you for everybody for your interesting questions and good questions. And that, I think we can